She entered the room as a servant, an invisible figure whose name no one bothered to remember. He brought her to Seattle's most powerful criminal gala, not out of kindness, but to humiliate her in front of everyone. But the moment she appeared under the chandelier, everything changed. The most powerful mob bosses stopped talking, politicians turned to look, and a secret buried 25 years ago began to unravel, a secret that could destroy his entire empire. If you enjoyed this story, please like and comment with the name of the city you're currently viewing to let me know how far the story has progressed. The rain had been falling on Seattle for 11 straight days, and the city smelled like rust and salt and something rotting beneath the pavement. Serena Vale stood barefoot on the cold tile of the service kitchen, her hands raw from bleach, her knuckles cracked and bleeding in the creases where skin met bone. She was scrubbing the grout between the floor tiles with a bristle brush that had lost half its bristles 3 months ago, and no one had replaced it, because no one replaced anything for the help. The Voss estate sat on a hill overlooking Elliott Bay, a sprawling compound of stone and glass and reinforced steel hidden behind ivy-covered walls. From the outside, it looked like old money. From the inside, it looked like a prison dressed up in Italian marble. Serena had lived here for 4 years. She knew every hallway, every locked door, every camera blind spot. She knew which floorboards creaked on the second level and which windows didn't latch properly in the east wing. She knew these things the way animals know the dimensions of their cage, not because she was planning anything, but because knowing was the only thing they couldn't take from her. She was 26 years old. She looked 30. Her dark hair was pulled back so tight it made the skin at her temples ache, and there were shadows under her eyes that never quite faded no matter how much sleep she got, which was never enough. The other staff avoided her, not out of cruelty, although there was cruelty too, but because proximity to silence made people uncomfortable. Serena rarely spoke. When she did, her voice came out flat and dry, like she was reading from a script she didn't believe in. The cook, a heavy-set woman named Margot, once told her she had the personality of a closed door. Serena hadn't argued. The intercom on the wall crackled. A voice, male, clipped, irritated, cut through the kitchen's humid quiet. "Serena, Mr. Voss's study, now." She didn't flinch. She set the brush down, dried her hands on the front of her uniform, and walked. Her bare feet left damp prints on the hallway floor that evaporated before anyone could follow them. Dante Voss's study occupied the entire northwest corner of the 3rd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the water, and on clear days you could see the Olympic Mountains cutting the horizon like teeth. Today there was nothing but gray. The room smelled like leather and cold coffee and the faint chemical bite of gun oil, though the weapons were never visible. They didn't need to be. Everyone who entered this room understood what lived in the drawers. Dante sat behind his desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He was 41 years old, lean in a way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation, with a jaw that looked like it had been set wrong after a break and never corrected. His eyes were the color of wet cement. He didn't look up when Serena entered. He was reading something on his phone, scrolling slowly with his thumb, his expression carved from the same stone as the walls. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Sit." She didn't sit, not out of defiance. There were no chairs on her side of the desk. There never were. Dante looked up. His gaze moved over her the way a man inspects equipment, checking for function, not feeling. "The gala is Saturday." Serena said nothing. She knew about the gala. The entire household had been preparing for weeks. The annual Syndicate Gala was the single largest gathering of criminal power on the West Coast. Bosses, underbosses, politicians who pretended they weren't bought, judges who pretended they were clean, and the occasional federal agent who had stopped pretending altogether. It was held in a different location every year, and this year Dante had chosen the Meridian, a converted warehouse on the waterfront that he'd purchased 6 months ago through a shell company. "You'll be attending," Dante said. The words landed in Serena's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She blinked. Once. "Sir? You heard me? I'm not staff for the event. Margot assigned the—" "I didn't ask what Margot assigned." Dante set his phone down and leaned back. The leather chair creaked under him. "I said you'll be attending, not serving. Attending. As a guest." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Serena's hands hung at her sides, and she could feel the sting of bleach in every crack of her skin. She understood power well enough to know that gifts from men like Dante Voss were never gifts. They were instruments. Why? She asked. Something shifted behind Dante's eyes. Not warmth, not anything close. More like the flicker of a match struck in a dark room, brief, purposeful, and gone. Because people have been talking, he said. About you. People talk about a lot of things. Not to me they don't, but I hear it anyway. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. His reflection in the glass was a smear of white shirt and dark hair. Moreno's people, the Cassano crew, even some of the politicians. They've noticed you, the quiet one, the one who moves through rooms like smoke. They find it interesting. Serena's stomach tightened. She kept her face empty. Interesting is dangerous in this world, Dante continued. When people start paying attention to someone who's supposed to be invisible, it creates problems, questions, speculation. He turned to face her, and his expression was something between contempt and calculation. So you'll attend the gala. You'll stand in that room, and every person there will see exactly what you are. A maid, nothing more. The fascination ends Saturday night. There it was, the instrument revealed. He wasn't inviting her. He was exhibiting her, placing her under the light so everyone could see how ordinary she was, how small, how utterly beneath the world she served. It was a controlled demolition of whatever mystique had accidentally gathered around her name. Is there a dress code? Serena asked, and her voice didn't waver, which cost her more than Dante would ever know. Elena will handle it. You'll be ready by 7. She nodded and turned to leave. Serena. She stopped but didn't turn around. Don't embarrass me, Dante said. That's not what this is for. She walked out without responding. Her bare feet made no sound on the marble floor, and by the time she reached the service staircase, her jaw ached from how hard she'd been clenching it. In the basement utility room where the staff kept their personal belongings in metal lockers that didn't lock, Serena sat on the concrete floor with her back against the wall and pressed her palms flat against the cold surface. Her breathing was even, controlled. She had learned a long time ago that the body could betray you faster than any enemy. Trembling hands, a cracked voice, wet eyes. These were currencies of weakness, and in this house, weakness was taxed at a rate no one could afford. She reached into her locker and pulled out a small wooden box, scratched and faded, with a broken hinge that she'd repaired twice with electrical tape. Inside, resting on a square of faded velvet, was a pendant, silver, tarnished almost black, shaped like a coiled serpent eating its own tail with a single star embedded in its center. It had belonged to her father. It was the only thing she had left of him. Lucien Vale. The name existed in her memory like a photograph left in the rain, edges dissolved, colors bleeding into each other, the image recognizable, but ruined. She had been 3 years old when he disappeared. Her mother, Elena, not the same Elena who would pick her dress for the gala, that coincidence of names still stung, had told her nothing useful. He left. He was bad. He was gone. Those 3 sentences were the entirety of her inheritance. Serena held the pendant in her palm. It was warm from being stored near the water heater. She closed her fingers around it and felt the edges bite into her skin. Saturday. She would walk into a room full of killers and thieves and men who bought silence the way other people bought groceries, and she would stand there while Dante Voss pointed at her like a museum exhibit, and everyone would nod and agree that she was nothing, and then she would come back to this basement and scrub floors until her knuckles bled again, and nothing would change. Nothing ever changed. She put the pendant back in the box and went upstairs to finish the grout. The next 3 days passed, the way days always passed in the Voss estate, in silence, in labor, in the careful choreography of people who had learned to make themselves small. Serena cleaned, she polished. She carried trays and emptied ashtrays and changed linens that didn't need changing because Dante's people confused activity with loyalty. Elena Marchetti, Dante's personal stylist and one of the few women in the organization who carried actual authority, appeared on Thursday with a garment bag and a look on her face that suggested she'd rather be doing literally anything else. Try this on, Elena said, dropping the bag on Serena's cot in the staff quarters. The room was shared with two other maids, both of whom were conveniently absent. Serena unzipped the bag. Inside was a dress, black, floor-length, high-necked, long-sleeved. It was the kind of dress you put on a woman you wanted to disappear inside her own clothing, modest to the point of erasure. He picked it himself, Elena said, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. She was watching Serena's face for a reaction the way a jeweler watches a stone for flaws. It's fine, Serena said. It's a shroud. Elena's voice dropped. He wants you to look like a shadow, something people glance at and forget. Then it'll work. Elena studied her for a long moment. There was something complicated behind her eyes. Not pity, because pity was useless here, but something adjacent. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of one trapped woman by another. Wear your hair down, Elena said quietly. Not pulled back, down. He didn't say anything about your hair. That's the point. Elena pushed off the doorframe. 7 o'clock Saturday. Don't be late. And for what it's worth, keep your chin up in that room, not because it'll help, because it'll make them uncomfortable. She left, and the garment bag hung from the closet rod, like something waiting to be filled with a body. Saturday arrived the way all dreaded things arrive, faster than expected and exactly on time. The convoy left the estate at 6:45 p.m. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows, 2 advance cars, and a trail vehicle Serena never saw but knew existed because she'd overheard the security detail discussing routes 2 days earlier. She rode in the middle vehicle, alone in the back seat, wearing the black dress and the pendant hidden beneath the high neckline, resting against her sternum where she could feel its weight with every breath. Her hair was down. It fell past her shoulders in dark waves she hadn't straightened or styled. She'd washed it with the cheap shampoo from the utility closet and let it dry on its own, and somehow it had cooperated for the first time in months. Her face was bare. No makeup, no concealer for the shadows under her eyes. She looked exactly like what she was. A working woman pulled from her labor and placed in a costume. The meridian rose out of the waterfront darkness like a cathedral built for commerce. Its exterior was industrial, exposed brick, steel beams, riveted panels. But through the massive arched windows, Serena could see the transformation. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling. The floor had been covered in black marble tiles that reflected light like water. Hundreds of candles lined the perimeter, their flames steady in the windless interior. The SUV stopped. A man in a dark suit opened her door. He didn't offer his hand. Serena stepped out into the cold night air. The rain had paused, but the sky was low and heavy, pressing down on the city like a hand on a chest. She could smell the bay, brine and diesel, and the faint sweetness of decay that all harbors carry. Dante was waiting at the entrance. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like armor, and his face carried the same expression it always did, controlled, appraising, slightly bored. He looked at Serena the way a director looks at an actor who has already been cast in a role they can't escape. "You wore the pendant," he said. His eyes had found it immediately, the chain barely visible above the neckline. "It's mine," Serena said. Something passed across his face, not anger, something older. "Stay close. Don't speak unless spoken to. And when they look at you, and they will look at you, remember why you're here." "To be small," Serena said. Dante didn't confirm or deny. He simply turned and walked toward the entrance, and Serena followed 2 steps behind, the way she'd been trained. The ballroom hit her like a wall of sound and light and perfume and danger. 300 people filled the space, their voices layered into a single continuous roar that vibrated in Serena's chest. She recognized faces from the estate, soldiers, lieutenants, moneymen, but the majority were strangers. Power wore different faces in this room. The heavy-jowled man by the bar was a state senator. The woman in red near the stage controlled shipping routes through the Panama Canal. The cluster of young men in expensive suits near the east wall were Moreno's crew, their smiles sharp and performative. Dante moved through the crowd like a blade through water, people parting, nodding, reaching for handshakes he accepted with mechanical precision. Serena trailed behind him, her eyes forward, her hands clasped in front of her, her breathing measured. She expected stares, she expected whispers, she expected the quiet cruelty of a room full of predators examining prey. What she did not expect was what actually happened. The first person to approach her was not a crime boss or a politician. It was a woman, mid-50s, silver hair, wearing enough diamonds to fund a small country, who stepped directly into Serena's path and looked at her with an intensity that bordered on violence. "You're the one from Voss's house," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I work for Mr. Voss, yes." The woman tilted her head. Her eyes moved over Serena's face with the precision of someone reading a document. "My name is Katerina Novak. I run the Novak family's operations in Vancouver. And you, girl, you don't belong in that dress." Serena felt the blood drain from her face. "I was told to wear it. Obviously, it's 3 sizes too large and it's cut to make you invisible. But here's the problem." Katerina leaned closer, and her perfume was sharp and expensive and aggressive. "You're not invisible. You walked into this room 30 seconds ago, and every man on the east side stopped talking. That doesn't happen because of a dress. That happens because of what's underneath it." Serena opened her mouth to respond, but Katerina had already moved past her, disappearing into the crowd like a shark returning to deep water. Over the next hour, it happened again, and again, and again. A lieutenant from the Cassano organization brought her a glass of champagne she hadn't asked for and stood too close when he handed it to her. A political aide whose name she didn't catch asked her 3 questions about the waterfront development project, treating her like a colleague rather than a servant. 2 women from the Moreno delegation, gorgeous, polished, dripping with confidence, positioned themselves on either side of her at the bar and made conversation as if she were their equal, their eyes sharp with the specific competitive anxiety of women who have just identified a threat. Serena answered every question with economy. She didn't flirt, she didn't perform. She stood in that oversized black dress with her unstyled hair and her bare face and her cracked hands hidden at her sides, and somehow, impossibly, infuriatingly, she commanded the room's attention without asking for it. Dante noticed. He was standing with a group of underbosses near the main stage, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, and his eyes kept cutting across the room to where Serena stood. Each time he looked, she was surrounded by more people. Each time he looked, the crowd around her had grown. His jaw tightened incrementally, the way a vice closes, slow, mechanical, inevitable. He had brought her here to be diminished. Instead, she was becoming the center of gravity. Arlo Vance, Dante's consigliere and the second most powerful man in the Voss Syndicate, appeared at his shoulder. Arlo was 53, silver-templed, with the soft hands and hard eyes of a man who had never thrown a punch, but had ordered thousands. He had been with Dante since the beginning, since before the Syndicate was a syndicate, when it was just 2 men and a shipping container full of stolen electronics on a pier in Tacoma. "Your maid is making friends," Arlo said. "I see that. Maybe you should pull her out." "And confirm that she matters?" Dante's voice was quiet and controlled, but something lived beneath it. "No, let it play. They'll lose interest." But they didn't lose interest. At 9:47 p.m., Serena would remember the exact time because the clock above the main entrance was the only thing she'd been staring at that didn't stare back. An old man approached her. He was ancient, 80, maybe older. His suit hung on his frame like fabric draped over scaffolding, and his hands trembled with a fine, persistent vibration that suggested either age or medication or both. But his eyes were clear, sharp. They belonged to a much younger man trapped inside a body that had betrayed him. His name was Victor Marchetti, no relation to Elena, as far as Serena knew, and he had been a patriarch of West Coast organized crime for longer than most of the people in this room had been alive. He had survived 4 assassination attempts, 2 federal indictments, and a stroke that had taken the use of his left arm. He walked with a cane carved from black walnut, and when he stopped in front of Serena, the people around her parted like water breaking around a stone. "Young lady," Victor said. His voice was a rasp, the sound of something dragged across gravel. "Come closer. My eyes aren't what they used to be." Serena stepped forward. She could smell peppermint and something medicinal beneath it. Victor's trembling hand reached toward her neck, not touching, hovering. His finger stopped an inch from the pendant, which had shifted during the evening and now hung visible against the dark fabric of her dress. The old man's face changed. The polite mask cracked, and beneath it was something raw. Shock, recognition, and a fear so old it had calcified into something like reverence. "Where did you get that?" Victor whispered. "It was my father's." "What was your father's name?" The room around them had gone quiet. Not silent. Conversations continued at the edges, but the immediate circle had stilled, the way animals freeze when they sense a predator. "Lucien," Serena said. "Lucien Vale." Victor Marchetti closed his eyes. His trembling hand curled into a fist and pressed against his chest, and for a moment Serena thought he was having another stroke. But when his eyes opened, they were wet and bright and focused on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "That pendant," Victor said, and his voice carried now, not shouting but projecting, the way a man speaks when he wants a room to hear him. "That symbol, the Ouroboros with the star. I haven't seen it in 25 years, not since the night Lucien Vale disappeared." Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Across the room, Dante Voss set his whiskey glass down with a sound like a gunshot. "Lucien Vale was a founder," Victor continued, his voice gaining strength as if the words themselves were feeding him. "One of the original three. Before there was a Voss Syndicate, before there was a Moreno family, before any of you children carved this coast into territories, there were three men who built the framework. Lucien Vale was one of them. And that pendant was his sigil, his bloodline marker, passed only to his direct descendants. The silence that followed was absolute. 300 people, every one of them dangerous, every one of them powerful, every one of them suddenly looking at Serena Vale with eyes that had completely recalibrated what they were seeing. She wasn't a maid. She was a bloodline. Serena stood motionless in the center of that silence, the pendant burning against her skin, and for the first time in 4 years she couldn't control her breathing. Her chest rose and fell too fast, and her hands, those cracked, bleach-raw hands, trembled at her sides. Dante was moving through the crowd toward her. She could see him in her peripheral vision, cutting through bodies like a knife, his face a mask of something she had never seen before. Not anger, not calculation. Fear. Arlo Vance was already on his phone, turning away from the crowd, his lips moving rapidly, his soft hand gripping the device so hard his knuckles had gone white. And somewhere in the back of the ballroom, in a shadow where the candlelight didn't reach, a man Serena had never seen before raised a phone of his own, snapped a photograph of the pendant hanging against her chest, and disappeared through a service exit without making a sound. The room erupted. Questions flew like shrapnel. Who is she? How long has Voss known? Is this legitimate? Does she have documentation? Where has she been? And through it all, Serena stood perfectly still, the eye of a hurricane she hadn't created and couldn't control. Dante reached her. He took her arm, not gently, not roughly, but with the specific pressure of a man gripping something he was afraid might slip away. "We're leaving," he said. "What just happened?" Serena's voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. Who was Lucien Vale? What did that man mean about a bloodline? "Not here." Dante pulled her toward the exit, his soldiers materializing around them like shadows given weight. "Not now." "You knew." The words came out before Serena could stop them, and they landed between her and Dante like a grenade with the pin already pulled. "You knew who my father was." Dante stopped walking. The crowd pressed around them, faces hungry, eyes bright with the specific greed that information inspires in dangerous people. He looked down at Serena, and in his eyes she saw the thing he had spent years building walls against. The truth. "Get in the car," he said. "Now." He released her arm and walked ahead. Serena followed, not 2 steps behind this time, but 3, 4, 5. The distance between them growing with every step, filling with questions neither of them was ready to answer. The SUV doors closed. The convoy pulled away from the Meridian. The rain started again, hammering the roof like fists. Serena sat in the back seat with the pendant in her hand, her knuckles white around it, and stared at the back of Dante's head through the partition glass. He was on his phone. His voice was low and vicious, the words inaudible, but the tone unmistakable. Someone had made a mistake. Someone had kept a secret. And whatever had been buried for 25 years had just clawed its way to the surface in front of every powerful person on the West Coast. In the front seat, Arlo Vance stared straight ahead through the windshield, his phone dark in his lap, his face absolutely, perfectly still. And his hands, those soft, uncalloused hands that had never thrown a punch, were shaking. The convoy moved through Seattle's wet streets in silence that had teeth. Rain came down hard enough to blur the streetlights into smears of orange and white, and the wipers on the lead SUV beat a rhythm that sounded like something counting down. Serena sat in the back seat with the pendant in her closed fist and watched the city slide past the tinted glass and tried to slow her breathing down to something that didn't announce itself. Dante rode in the front vehicle. Arlo sat in the passenger seat of Serena's SUV, separated from her by the partition, and hadn't moved in 12 minutes. She'd been counting. His phone sat dark on his thigh. His reflection in the glass was a man performing stillness poorly. The estate gates opened before the lead car reached them. Someone had called ahead. Inside, the household staff had vanished. The kitchen lights were off. The hallways that were usually populated with the low-grade activity of a large property, someone carrying linens, someone running a vacuum, the distant clatter of dishes, were empty and silent. Serena walked from the garage entrance through the service corridor and stopped at the base of the main staircase because Dante's voice came down from the second floor like a stone thrown from a height. "Arlo, now!" Arlo passed Serena without looking at her. His shoulder nearly clipped hers. She watched him climb the stairs, his hand on the rail, his posture rigid in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what waited at the top. Serena stood at the bottom of the staircase for a long moment. The marble was cold through the thin soles of her shoes. The pendant was still in her hand. She looked down at it, the coiled serpent, the single embedded star, the tarnish that had turned silver to something the color of a bruise. And then she closed her fingers around it and climbed. She didn't go to the second floor. She went to the third, to the narrow hallway outside Dante's study, where the ventilation shaft ran along the floor and sound traveled in ways the architect had never intended. She'd discovered this 18 months ago while replacing a vent cover. She pressed her back against the wall 6 feet from the study door and breathed through her mouth and listened. "Can't contain it." Dante's voice, low and flat and stripped of everything except function. "Marchetti just announced it to the whole room. Half those people have already made calls." "I know." Arlo's voice, careful, measured, the voice of a man walking a ledge. "But nothing is confirmed. The pendant doesn't prove lineage. It could have been stolen, sold, passed through a dozen hands." She said her father's name. A pause. She could have heard the name somewhere. People talk. The Vale bloodline is history, Dante. It's Victor Marchetti nearly had a cardiac event on a ballroom floor when he saw that pendant. Victor, who has seen every con and every play in this business for 50 years. The sound of something being set down hard. A glass, maybe. "Don't tell me what the pendant doesn't prove." Another pause. Longer this time. "You need to find out where she got it," Arlo said. "Where she actually came from. What she actually knows." "I know where she came from. I've always known." The words dropped into the silence like something irretrievable. And then, quieter. "That was the problem." Serena stopped breathing. The floorboard beneath her left foot chose that moment to shift and produce a sound like a question mark. Muffled, but present. The conversation inside the study stopped. She moved. Fluid and fast, down the hallway and around the corner, pressing into the alcove where the linen storage cabinet sat. Her heart was throwing itself against her ribs with an urgency she hadn't felt since childhood. She heard the study door open, heard footsteps, heard them stop. Then nothing. Then the door closed again. She stayed in the alcove for 7 minutes before she moved. She didn't sleep. She sat on her cot in the staff quarters with the lights off and the pendant on the mattress beside her, and turned the words over in her head like rocks she was trying to see beneath. "I know where she came from. I've always known." The implications of that sentence were a room she wasn't ready to enter. so she circled it instead, approaching from different angles, testing the walls. Dante Voss had known Lucien Vale. That much was now obvious. The criminal architecture of the West Coast had been built on the foundation of three men, and Dante had inherited pieces of that structure. He had known who Serena was, or might be, and he had kept her here, in his household, in the most invisible role available. Not in ignorance, in deliberate concealment. The question was who he'd been hiding her from, or whether he'd been hiding her from herself. Dawn came gray and wet, and offering nothing. At 6 a.m, there was a knock on the staff quarters door. A knock which was unusual since the usual method of communication in this house was a terse intercom call. Serena opened it. Elena Marchetti stood in the corridor in street clothes, not her work clothes, which meant she'd come from outside, which meant she'd left and returned before sunrise. "Get dressed," Elena said. "Not the uniform, street clothes. Come to the kitchen." "Why?" Elena's eyes moved past Serena's shoulder into the empty room. "Because I know what Arlo Vance is doing this morning, and you need to hear it before he finishes." The kitchen was cold. Someone had turned the heating off overnight. Elena stood at the island counter with a cup of black coffee and didn't offer Serena one. They faced each other across the butcher block, and Elena looked like a woman who had been awake all night running calculations. "Arlo called the Moreno people at 2 a.m., Elena said. "My brother works security for Moreno's Chicago operation. He passed it to me an hour ago." Serena said nothing. She waited. "Arlo told them the Vale Air claim is fabricated, that you're a plant, an actress or a con artist brought in by a rival faction to destabilize Voss territory by triggering dormant bloodline protocols." Elena paused. "Do you know what dormant bloodline protocols are?" "No." "The original founders, Vale, Marchetti Sr., and a third man named Cass, whose family died out, they built a governance structure into the Syndicate charter. If a founding bloodline produces a verified heir, that heir has the right to claim a seat on the council. Not ownership of the Voss Syndicate specifically, a governing seat. It would shift the power balance significantly." Elena set her coffee down. "That's what Arlo is trying to prevent. By making me a liar before anyone can test the claim. By making you a threat that needs to be neutralized." Elena's voice stayed flat. "There's a difference. A liar gets discredited. A threat gets removed." The word "removed" sat in the air between them, with its true meaning fully visible, making no effort to disguise itself. Serena's fingers found the pendant through the fabric of her jacket. "How long do I have before Moreno's people accept Arlo's version? He's good at this. He's been doing it for 30 years. I'd say he buys himself 48 hours of uncertainty before Victor Marchetti's testimony starts to outweigh the narrative." Elena picked her coffee back up. "The question is what Dante knows and what he's willing to do about it. Dante said something last night. He said he'd always known where I came from." Something moved behind Elena's eyes. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a fact that had been suspected finally stepping into the light. Then the question becomes who told him, and how long ago? The kitchen door opened. Dante walked in wearing the same clothes he'd had on the night before. He hadn't slept either. That was visible in the precise way his exhaustion had arranged itself. The jaw looser, the eyes slightly sunken, the controlled stillness of a man whose control was costing him more than usual. He looked at Elena first, then at Serena. "Go," he said to Elena. Elena looked at Serena. A brief look, the kind that carries information that can't be spoken. Then she picked up her coffee and left. Dante stood on the opposite side of the island from Serena and put his hands flat on the butcher block. He looked at them rather than her. His knuckles were prominent. His watch face was turned inward toward his wrist, a habit she'd noticed before. A man who preferred not to be tracked by time. "You were outside my study last night," he said. "Yes." "What did you hear?" "Enough." His hands pressed harder against the wood. "Ask what you want to ask." Serena looked at him across the cold kitchen. In 4 years, she had stood in this man's presence hundreds of times and said thousands of words, most of them operational, none of them real. She had learned his silence is the way you learn weather, not the science of it, but the feeling in your bones before it arrives. Right now, the feeling in her bones was the specific atmospheric pressure that preceded something catastrophic. Did you know who my father was when you hired me? Dante looked up. Yes. The directness of it was almost violent. She hadn't expected it. She'd prepared for deflection, for the layered non-answers that were currency in this house. The simple affirmative landed like a fist. How? Lucian Vale and I worked together for 2 years before he disappeared. I was 23. He was building the framework that would eventually become the Syndicate council structure. I was a runner for one of his operations. Dante pulled out the stool on his side of the island and sat down, not relaxing but reducing the performance of his own authority, just slightly. When he vanished, I spent 6 years trying to find out what happened to him. What I found instead was you. Me. A woman in her early 20s, cleaning houses for cash under the table, moving every few months, using 3 different names, carrying a pendant she never took off. He paused. I had you background checked. The identity you were using was clean, but the biometric data my people pulled, you surveilled me. I protected you. The sharpness in his voice was defensive in a way that surprised her. You didn't know what you were carrying. You had no idea what that pendant meant, what it could attract. What would happen if certain people identified you before you could what? Serena's voice stayed level, but her hands were fists now at her sides. Control the situation? Keep me invisible until it suited you to use me? Keep you alive. He said it simply. No performance. Lucian Vale didn't disappear. He was murdered, and the people who killed him never found his heir because his heir was living under a false name in a suburb of Portland cleaning houses for $20 an hour. The kitchen was very quiet. The rain had stopped and the morning was just starting to push gray light through the window above the sink. Who killed him? Serena asked. Dante's jaw worked. He picked up a pen from the counter, looked at it, set it back down. I don't have proof. I have a long time of suspicion that I can't speak out loud until it's solid. Who? Dante? It was the first time she had used his name. Not Mr. Voss, not Sir. Just the name, blunt and direct, and it landed between them like a match dropped in a dry place. He looked at her. The cement gray eyes held something she hadn't seen in them before. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a secret so long he's forgotten what his back felt like without it. Someone in this organization, he said. And then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something closed in his face, not shutting her out, but shutting himself in, the way a door closes against weather. He stood up. This conversation isn't finished, Serena said. I know. He moved toward the door. Stay in the estate. Don't contact anyone. Don't tell anyone what you heard last night from Marchetti or what I just told you. And Arlo? He stopped walking. I know what Arlo is doing this morning, Serena said. Elena told me. Dante's back was to her. She could see the shift in his shoulders, the small, precise rearrangement of a man absorbing information that changes the shape of the room he's standing in. I'll handle Arlo, he said, the same way you've handled everything, quietly, invisibly, while people like me get kept in houses and told to stay small. He turned. The look on his face was complicated in a way she didn't have vocabulary for. Not anger, not guilt. Something between the two that lived in the place where intentions go when they've made a ruin of themselves. Give me 48 hours, he said. To do what? To find the proof. He held her gaze. Then we talk about everything. He left. His footsteps moved up the main staircase, quick and purposeful. A door closed on the second floor. His voice started up again, low, rapid, controlled, and Serena stood alone in the cold kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and tried to decide if the man who had just spoken to her was the most honest he'd ever been or the most calculating. She decided the most honest answer was that it was both. By noon, the estate had changed its texture. The security detail had doubled overnight, and the additional men moved through the property with the specific vigilance of people who had been briefed on a threat without being given its shape. Serena watched them from the window of the staff quarters. 2 on the perimeter gate, 1 at the garage. A rotation she didn't recognize on the South Garden path. At 1 p.m., a car she didn't recognize arrived at the service entrance. Not a Syndicate vehicle. Too ordinary, too clean, a silver sedan with no plates she could see from her angle. Two men got out. She didn't know them. They went inside and didn't come out. She went looking for Elena and found the stylist's office locked, the lights off. She tried the intercom. No response. She tried 3 other staff members. Found no one. The estate had been emptied around her with the precision of a stage being cleared between acts, and she hadn't noticed it happening until it was already done. At 2:15 p.m., her room door opened without a knock. Arlo Vance stood in the doorway with his soft hands visible at his sides, and his silver hair combed into its precise part, and his face arranged into an expression of professional concern that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Serena," he said, "I think we need to talk." She looked at him, at those steady hands, the manicured nails, the careful stillness of a man who had never needed to be fast because he had always been ahead, and felt something cold move through her that wasn't fear. It was recognition. "About what?" she said. "About last night. About what Marchetti said and what it means for your safety." He stepped inside without being invited and left the door open, which was worse somehow than if he'd closed it. "Dante asked me to check on you. He's concerned. He didn't mention that when I saw him this morning. He's had developments since then." Arlo moved to the window. He looked out at the garden, at the security rotation she'd been watching. There are people who took what Marchetti said very seriously, people who would want to verify the claim, and not in a friendly way. "You mean the people you called at 2 a.m., Serena said. "Moreno's people." Arlo turned from the window. The professional concern was still on his face, but beneath it something shifted, like the frame of a painting that has just been jostled. Everything's still in place, but you can see the wall behind it now. "Elena talks too much," he said. His voice had dropped. Not threatening, just lower, the social lubrication gone. "She told me you called them. She didn't tell me what else you've told them over the years." Serena kept her voice flat. Her hands were in her jacket pockets. "But I'm starting to have some ideas about that too." Arlo looked at her for a long moment. The man behind the mask was older than the mask. Harder. "You should be careful," he said, "about what ideas you speak out loud in this house." "Why? I'm just a maid." He almost smiled. The almost was the most frightening thing she'd seen all day. "You were," he said. He left. He pulled the door most of the way closed behind him, but not all the way, and she heard his footsteps move down the corridor toward the main staircase, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man who doesn't need to run because he controls what there is to run from. Serena sat on her cot and pressed her palms against her thighs and breathed. In, out, slow, even. She thought about what Dante had said. 48 hours. Find the proof. She thought about Arlo's face when she'd mentioned the 2 a.m. call. The mask adjusting over something that wasn't concern or professionalism, but something colder and more patient. Something that had been waiting a very long time to finish something it had started. She thought about her father, the man who had disappeared when she was 3, the founder who had built an empire and then been erased from it with such thoroughness that his own daughter had grown up knowing nothing but a name. She pulled the pendant out from beneath her jacket and held it in her palm. The Ouroboros. The serpent eating its own tail. The symbol of something that never ends, that cycles back on itself, that destroys and creates in the same motion. 25 years. She stood up. She went to the door and looked down the corridor. Empty. She went the opposite direction from the main staircase toward the back of the estate, toward the old wing that had been locked and unused for as long as she'd worked here, toward the door at the end of the hall that she had noticed 2 weeks ago had a different lock than the others. A newer lock. On an older door. She stood in front of it and looked at the deadbolt that someone had installed recently, enough that the paint around the frame hadn't yellowed. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt the small tension wrench and pick she'd carried for 3 years. Not because she planned anything, but because knowing was the only thing they couldn't take from her. And not because she was good at it, she was adequate, practiced in the specific way that people who have nothing become skilled at the things that cost nothing to learn, but because the lock itself was cheap. New hardware, cheap core. Someone had installed it in a hurry, prioritizing speed over security, which told her something about the urgency of whatever was behind the door. The room beyond was dark and smelled like paper and machine oil, and the particular staleness of a space that had been sealed against human breath for weeks. She found the light switch by feel. A pull cord, old-fashioned, the bulb overhead fluorescent and slow to warm. It flickered twice before it held. Filing cabinets. 4 of them, steel, gray, lining the left wall. A folding table in the center with a laptop and an external hard drive, and a stack of manila folders held together with a rubber band that had dried and cracked and left a brown stain on the top folder's cover. A cork board on the right wall covered in photographs and printed documents, connected by lengths of red string that someone had pinned with such methodical precision that the whole thing looked less like an investigation board and more like a diagram of a disease spreading through a population. Serena stood in the doorway and looked at the corkboard. In the center, printed on a single sheet of paper and pinned with a red thumbtack, was a name she recognized. Lucien Vale. Around it, connected by the red string, were faces. Some she knew. Victor Marchetti. Moreno's current underboss. 3 politicians whose names she'd seen in the news. A federal prosecutor named Harlan Webb, who had been assigned to organized crime cases in the Pacific Northwest for the past decade, and whose photograph had been cut from a newspaper, the edges uneven. And in the lower right corner of the board, connected to Lucien Vale's name by a single strand of red string that ran longer than all the others. A photograph she had to step closer to identify because her brain resisted what her eyes were reporting. Arlo Vance, 25 years younger, standing beside a man whose profile she had spent her entire adult life not knowing and 3 seconds recognizing with the specific bone-deep certainty that bypasses logic entirely. Her father, Lucien Vale, alive in a photograph, smiling, which was the detail that destroyed her, because she had spent 23 years constructing a man from nothing, and the construction had never included a smile. She crossed the room and unpinned the photograph and held it under the fluorescent light. The back of it had a date written in blue pen. Not Dante's handwriting. She knew Dante's handwriting from 4 years of handling his correspondence. This was smaller, rounder. It took her a moment to identify it because she had only seen it on one document, her employment contract. Arlo's handwriting. She put the photograph in her jacket pocket and started opening folders. The first folder contained shipping manifests, cargo routes between Seattle, Vancouver, and 3 ports in Eastern Europe. The dates ran from 28 years ago to 2 years before Lucien Vale disappeared. The cargo was listed in code, but the codes weren't sophisticated. She'd handled enough of Dante's operational documents to parse the substitutions. Weapons components, small arms, the kind of inventory that moved through legitimate shipping networks by being distributed across dozens of containers, nothing large enough to flag automated screening. The second folder contained financial records, shell companies, most of them dissolved, their dissolution dates all clustering in the 6-month period following Lucien Vale's disappearance. The money that had flowed through them, substantial, in the tens of millions, had been rerouted in the dissolution, and the routing numbers led to an account structure she would need more time and more expertise to fully trace. The third folder contained a handwritten memo, 4 pages. The paper aged to the color of old teeth, the handwriting the same round, careful script from the back of the photograph. She read it standing at the folding table with the fluorescent light buzzing above her, and the blood moving through her body with a heaviness she hadn't felt before, like it had changed its consistency. The memo was addressed to no one. It read like a confession written for an audience of one, the kind of document a man produces not for posterity, but because the weight of what he knows has become too heavy to carry without setting some of it down somewhere. Lucien Vale had discovered the weapons network, not stumbled across it, investigated it, deliberately, methodically, over the course of 8 months, during which time he had apparently maintained complete operational normalcy while building a case that would have exposed not just the network, but the men at its center. He had brought his findings to 2 people. The memo named them. The first name was Dante Voss. The second name was Arlo Vance. The memo documented what happened next. Lucien had expected action, an internal purge, the kind of decisive violence that organizations like theirs used to cauterize corruption before it spread. Instead, he received delays, questions about his methodology, requests for more documentation, more specificity, more proof. And while he gathered what was asked of him, someone began systematically eliminating the people he'd used as sources. The memo ended mid-sentence on the fourth page, the pen stroke trailing off as if interrupted. Below it, in different ink, Arlo had added 3 words. Problem resolved. A V. Serena set the folder down on the table and pressed both hands flat against its surface and breathed. The fluorescent light buzzed. The room smelled like paper and oil and 25 years of someone else's guilt. She understood now, the shape of it, the architecture of what had been done and what had been concealed, and why she had ended up where she had. Lucien had brought the evidence to Dante. Dante, at 23, running operations for a man he believed in, had done what young men in that world do when they're not yet in charge of anything. He had told his superior, his mentor, the man who had helped build everything alongside Lucien Vale. He had told Arlo. And Arlo had resolved the problem. The sound she made was not a cry. It was something structural. The noise a beam makes when the weight above it finally exceeds its tolerance. Not dramatic, not loud, just the irreversible announcement of collapse. She picked up the photograph again. Her father's smile. Arlo's arm, not quite around his shoulders but close. The casual proximity of men who trusted each other completely. She put the photograph back in her pocket and picked up the laptop and opened it. Password protected. She set it aside. No time. And the hard drive might be more accessible. She picked up the external drive and weighed it in her hand. Small enough to pocket. She took it. She was replacing the folders in the approximate order she'd found them when she heard the footstep. Not on the floorboard, on the threshold. The specific sound of a shoe sole making contact with the old wood at the exact moment the person wearing it decides to stop. Serena turned. Arlo stood in the doorway. He was still wearing his afternoon clothes. His hands were visible and empty, which didn't mean anything in this business, and his face had completed its transition from the professional mask to whatever lived underneath it. What lived underneath it was older than she'd expected, more tired. The face of a man who has been solving the same problem for 25 years and has recently received information that the problem has a new iteration. "You're faster than I thought," he said. Serena said nothing. She was measuring the distance between herself and the door, which he was occupying, and the window which was painted shut. "The drive," Arlo said, extending his hand. "And the photograph. I know you took the photograph. The photograph of you and my father." Something moved in his face. Not guilt. Guilt required a belief that things could have been otherwise, and Arlo Vance had clearly stopped believing that a very long time ago. But something adjacent. A recognition of the specific way that facts arrange themselves into verdicts. "It was not personal," he said. "He was my father. He was a man who was going to destroy everything we'd built." Arlo's voice was even, professional. The voice he used to explain complex operational decisions to people who needed the complexity simplified. The network was generating $12 million a year. The political relationships we'd purchased through it protected the entire organization. Lucien was going to tear it down because his conscience demanded it. A pause. His conscience was a luxury no one could afford. "So you had him killed." "I resolved a threat to the organization." He said it without inflection, the way an engineer describes the removal of a faulty component. "I've resolved many threats in 30 years. It's what I do. It's what Dante pays me to do." "Does Dante know?" Serena asked. "Does he know it was you?" The pause before Arlo answered was a fraction too long. "Dante knows what he needs to know," Arlo said. And there it was, the gap in the architecture. Because if Dante knew, Arlo wouldn't be here alone. He'd have a solution already in motion, cleared from the top, clean and sanctioned. The fact that he was standing in this doorway with his empty hands and his tired face meant that whatever he was about to do had not been cleared by anyone. "He doesn't know," Serena said. "You've been managing what he knows for 30 years. Arlo's jaw tightened. The drive. The photograph. Now. "And then what? I disappear the same way my father did? Another problem resolved?" "It doesn't have to be." "Don't." The word came out harder than she'd planned, carrying everything she'd been holding since the kitchen that morning, since the ballroom the night before, since 4 years of cold tile and bleach raw hands, and the deliberate small humiliations of invisibility. Don't tell me it doesn't have to be anything. You've made every decision that brought me to this room. Don't pretend the next one is mine to make. Arlo looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a phone and made a call with the ease of a man ordering dinner. "It's time," he said into it. "Bring the car around." He lowered the phone. "I'm not going to hurt you here," he said. "This estate has too many cameras, too many staff who are loyal to Dante and not to me. What's going to happen is you're going to come with me. We're going to have a longer conversation somewhere appropriate, and at the end of it, we're going to reach an arrangement. I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't have a choice. Dante is in a meeting with 6 underbosses that will last another 2 hours. His security detail is occupied with a perimeter incident I arranged 40 minutes ago. There are 2 men outside this hallway who work for me, not for Voss." He held out his hand again. Steady, patient. "The drive and the photograph, and we walk out of here without a scene. You cause a scene, the men outside the hallway will interpret it as a security threat. You don't want them to do that." Serena looked at his hand. She looked at the corkboard behind her, at her father's name in the center of all that red string, all those connections, all that evidence of a conspiracy that had outlasted the man who uncovered it by a quarter century. She reached into her pocket. She held out the external drive. Arlo took it. He held out his hand again. She reached into her other pocket and gave him the photograph. He looked at it briefly. Something crossed his face. The photograph, the 2 men in it, the smile her father was wearing. And then he folded it in half and put it in his jacket pocket and turned toward the door. "After you," he said. The 2 men outside in the hallway were large and quiet, and positioned to prevent exact the kind of movement Serena was calculating. She walked between them down the corridor toward the back staircase, and the distance between her and any possible help stretched with every step. Her mind was running fast and flat, the emotional response locked in a compartment she didn't have time to open. Find the exit, not the physical exit, the logical one, the gap in the arrangement of forces around her that she could push through before it closed. She found it at the bottom of the back staircase. Margot, the cook, standing in the service entrance with a delivery manifest in one hand and her phone in the other, looking at Serena with the specific expression of a woman who has worked in this house long enough to recognize when something is wrong. Their eyes met for a single second. Serena said nothing. She didn't have to. 4 years of shared space, shared silence, and the cook's particular habit of watching people, not out of nosiness, but out of the survival instinct of someone who had worked for dangerous men long enough to know that the details were where the safety was, had given Margot a vocabulary for exactly this kind of moment. Margot looked down at her phone. Her thumb moved. Then she went back to her delivery manifest and said nothing. The car was waiting at the service entrance. Serena got in because she had calculated the outcome of not getting in and found it worse. The 2 men sat on either side of her. Arlo sat in the front passenger seat. The driver pulled out through the service gate and turned north, away from the city center, toward the industrial waterfront where the old Voss shipping operation still occupied a quarter-mile of pier. Arlo didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. He looked at his phone. He sent messages. He was managing something. She could see the cadence of it. The rapid responses, the pauses while he waited, the micro-expressions of someone running a complex operation through a small screen. Then he put the phone down and looked out the window. "Your father was brilliant," he said. "I want you to know that, genuinely. The framework he built for the council structure, the legal insulation, the governance protocols, has protected this organization for 25 years. He was the smartest man in any room he entered." A pause. That was also why he was dangerous. Serena stared at the back of the headrest in front of her. Complimenting him doesn't make what you did into something else. I'm not trying to. I'm giving you context. I have enough context. You have a folder's worth. You don't have the full picture. He half turned in the seat. Lucien didn't just find the weapons network. He found the buyers. Do you understand what that means? The buyers were federal, 3 agencies. People so far inside the system that exposing them would have triggered a response that would have leveled every criminal organization on the West Coast. Not prosecuted, leveled. There would have been nothing left. Not the Voss operation, not the Moreno family, not the political infrastructure we'd spent 20 years building. Serena said nothing. I made a calculation, Arlo said. One man against an entire ecosystem. I have been making calculations like that my entire professional life. The math on that one was not complicated. He had a daughter, Serena said. Was she in your calculation? The silence that followed was the most honest thing Arlo Vance had produced in the entire conversation. She watched the back of his head and let the silence do its work. No, he said finally. She was not. The car stopped. They were at the shipping terminal. The old one, not the Meridian, not any of the active Voss operations, but the original pier where she had heard, in fragments of overheard conversation across 4 years, the organization had begun. The buildings were corrugated steel, half of them rusted through at the corners, the kind of industrial architecture that exists in every port city and attracts attention from no one because it looks exactly like itself. The men on either side of her got out. One opened her door. Serena stepped out into the salt wind and looked at the pier stretching out over the black water of the Sound. The clouds had broken slightly in the west, and a thin line of late sun was cutting the horizon like a scar. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. She had not reached for it. She had not reached for it because Arlo's men were the kind of men who watched for reaching, and she only had one chance. Margot's thumb. Moving on the screen. The question was what message Margot had sent, and to whom, and whether it was enough. Arlo came around the front of the car. He had the external drive in his hand and an expression that suggested the conversation was about to move into its final phase, the phase where calculations were completed and results were implemented. I want to show you something, he said. He held up the drive. There's more on here than what's in those folders. Documentation of the buyers I mentioned, the federal contacts. The reason this network has stayed buried for 25 years despite every attempt to surface it. He turned the drive over in his fingers. If this goes public, it doesn't just destroy me. It destroys Dante. It destroys the council. It creates a vacuum that the people currently buying from us will fill with something considerably worse than we are. That sounds like a reason to tell the truth, Serena said. It sounds like a reason to be very careful about who holds the truth and what they do with it. He looked at her steadily. Your father made the mistake of thinking the truth was an instrument he could control. He could not. But you're not your father. You're something different. You've survived things he never had to survive. You understand invisibility in ways he never did. A pause. I'm offering you a place in this. A real place. Not what Marchetti's bloodline protocols would give you. A ceremonial seat on a council of old men. A real place. Knowledge, resources, protection. In exchange for what you found in that room, staying in that room. Serena looked at him, at the drive in his hand, at the pier behind him, and the black water and the thin line of sun dying at the edge of the sky. You killed my father, she said, and now you're offering me his seat at the table. I'm offering you survival, Arlo said, the same thing I've been offering everyone for 30 years. Behind him, from somewhere in the maze of corrugated steel buildings along the pier, came the sound that Serena had been listening for since they left the estate. Not sirens, not the organized approach of law enforcement, the specific sound of a car driven fast over bad pavement, braking hard, the engine still running when the door opened. Arlo turned. Dante Voss stepped out of the car with his jacket gone and his sleeves still rolled, and the specific expression of a man who has just been given information that has restructured the entire architecture of the last 30 years of his life. And in his right hand was a phone, and on the phone's screen, visible even at distance in the fading light, was a photograph. The photograph Arlo had folded and put in his jacket pocket, now somehow transmitted, somehow reproduced, somehow in Dante's possession. Margot had not sent a message. She had sent a photograph. Dante looked at Arlo with the cement-gray eyes, and the thing in them was not anger. Anger was too simple, too clean. It was the specific devastation of a man discovering that the ground he has been standing on for 30 years was never ground at all. Arlo, he said, his voice was very quiet. Tell me what I'm looking at. Arlo's hand, with the external drive in it, lowered slowly to his side. The professional stillness was still there, the long-practiced control, but beneath it something had shifted irrevocably, the way a fault line shifts. Not visibly, not loudly, but with consequences that would take years to fully measure. "It's complicated," Arlo said. "Then start at the beginning," Dante said. And the pier was very quiet, except for the water and the wind and the sound of Arlo Vance deciding how much of the truth he could afford to sell. He chose wrong. He chose a version, partial, architecturally sound, designed to reframe rather than confess, and Dante listened to it for 90 seconds before he crossed the distance between them and took the external drive out of Arlo's hand with a grip that left marks. "That's not what I asked," Dante said. "I asked you to start at the beginning." "Dante, Lucien Vale. Start there." The two men who had accompanied Serena had positioned themselves with the instinctive loyalty calibration that men in that world perform constantly, reading the room, assessing the weight, deciding which way the structure was going to fall, and getting on the correct side of it before it did. They had taken 2 steps back and to the sides, away from Arlo. Arlo saw it. His face did something complicated. "He was going to expose the network," Arlo said. "The buyers were federal. If it had come out, I know what would have happened. I was there." Dante's voice was the flattest Serena had ever heard it, which was saying something. Flat in a way that suggested the temperature beneath it was extreme in one direction and being held there by force. "I told you to bring me his evidence. I told you I would handle it myself. And then you told me he'd gone. Disappeared. You told me he'd run because he couldn't face what he'd found. He was a liability. He was my partner." The words came out slow and separated, each one carrying its own weight. "And you told me he ran." The silence on the pier had changed its quality. It was no longer the silence of a confrontation in progress. It was the silence of a verdict being rendered. Arlo straightened. Whatever calculation he'd been running had arrived at its conclusion, and the conclusion was that there was no version of the next 10 minutes that looked like the last 30 years. He had spent 30 years in the gap between what Dante knew and what was true, and that gap had just closed. "Everything I did," Arlo said, "I did for this organization. You did it for the network, the 12 million a year." Dante looked at him. "How much of it went to you personally?" "I'll find out, but I want to hear it from you first." Arlo said nothing. Dante turned to the 2 men who had stepped away. "Put him in the car. Not the facility. The warehouse on Clement. I want him there when I'm done here." The men moved. Arlo let them, which told Serena everything about how thoroughly his internal calculation had been completed. He had played every card he had, and the hand had still lost. He walked between the 2 men toward the second car with the upright posture of someone performing dignity as a final act of self-preservation. Then he stopped. He turned and looked at Serena across the distance of the pier, and his expression was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him. Not regret, not apology, but the specific look of a man acknowledging that he has produced an outcome he did not engineer. "Your father had your eyes," he said. "Same color, same—" He stopped, looked away. "Same way of seeing through things." The men moved him toward the car. He didn't resist. Serena watched until the car door closed. Then she looked at Dante. He was looking at the drive in his hand. "How much is on here, Da?" he asked. "Enough." She paused. "The buyers, the routing. 30 years of a weapons network running through Voss shipping operations. Financial records." She paused again. "And what he did to my father." Dante closed his hand around the drive. He looked out at the water. The last of the sun had gone, and the horizon was just a dark line where black sky met black sound. The wind off the water was the kind that got inside clothing and stayed there. "I need to know," Serena said. "How much you knew?" He didn't answer immediately. He let the wind fill the silence for a moment that was long enough to be its own kind of answer. "I knew the network existed," he said. "Arlo brought me in on pieces of it in the early years. Told me it was a legacy arrangement, already embedded, too connected to extract without damage. I believed him because I was 24, and he had been doing this since before I could drive." He turned the drive over in his hand. "I didn't know he had killed Lucien. I believed what he told me. I believed it for 30 years because Arlo was the most competent person I have ever worked with, and the most careful liar. But you knew something was wrong. I knew something was wrong, he confirmed. I just didn't know the shape of it until tonight. Serena watched his face. She had become, over 4 years of proximity to a powerful and controlled man, very good at identifying the difference between a constructed statement and a true one. The construction was in the word choice and the pacing. The truth was in the things the body did that the mind didn't supervise. His hands were shaking, very slightly, just the fine tremor of a man holding himself together at the granular level. She believed him. She didn't know yet what to do with that. We need to move, Dante said. Whatever Arlo told Moreno's people last night about you being a plant, that story has been circulating for 18 hours. Some of them will have discounted it when Victor Marchetti started making calls this morning. But some of them won't. And the ones who won't are going to want to close this before the bloodline claim gets formally verified. Close it how? He looked at her. The same way they close everything they don't want opened. The convoy back to the estate moved fast. 4 vehicles instead of the previous 3. The additional car full of men Dante had apparently been holding at a position 2 miles from the pier in case the night went in a specific direction. The fact that he had anticipated needing them told her he had come to the pier with more information than she'd understood in the moment. Margot's photograph had not been the first thing he'd received tonight. In the SUV, Dante made calls she didn't try to follow. His voice was low and rapid, the cadence of a man pushing pieces across a board at speed. She caught fragments, a council, Marchetti, timeline, documentation, and assembled a partial picture that was more alarming than reassuring. The drive was in Dante's inside jacket pocket. Her father's evidence. 30 years of buried truth pressed against his ribs. She thought about Arlo's face saying your father had your eyes, and she pushed the thought away because if she let it open, it would open completely, and she did not have that luxury right now. The estate was fully lit when they arrived. Security everywhere. Dante's people, the loyal ones, moved through the property with the specific urgency of people who have received new instructions and are implementing them at speed. The kitchen, the corridors, the main entrance hall. Everywhere she looked, men were repositioning. Margot was in the kitchen, sitting at the island with her hands wrapped around a mug of something she wasn't drinking, her face carrying the expression of a woman who has done something irrevocable and is sitting with the weight of it. She looked up when Serena came in. "Thank you," Serena said. Margot nodded once. "How bad is it?" "I don't know yet." "That bad," Margot said, and looked back at her mug. Serena went upstairs. She went to her room and changed out of the black gala dress into clothes she could move in. Dark jeans, boots, a jacket with enough pockets. She transferred what she had left from the locked room. A folded copy she'd made of the most critical page of the memo, photographed with her phone in the 30 seconds before Arlo appeared in the doorway, now stored in her phone's encrypted folder. She was doing her boots when Dante appeared in the doorway. He knocked on the open door, which surprised her. She looked up. "Moreno's underboss is requesting a council meeting," he said. "Emergency session. 12 hours. About the bloodline claim. About you. They want to verify or disqualify before the claim gets any further traction." He leaned against the doorframe. "Victor Marchetti is already pushing for verification. He has documentation he's been holding for 20 years. Apparently Lucien left materials with him before he disappeared. Victor thought they were meaningless until last night." Serena's hand stilled on the bootlace. "My father left documentation with Marchetti. Bloodline records, a chain of custody for the pendant, birth certificates, maternal line, the whole genealogical record." He paused. "He was protecting you. He knew something was wrong, that the network was more dangerous than he'd anticipated, that exposing it would make him a target. He left the documentation with Victor so that if something happened to him, his heir could eventually be identified." Serena sat with that for a moment. The image of a man, her father's face from the photograph, the smile she hadn't expected, making preparations for the possibility of his own death while simultaneously trusting the wrong person with the information he'd uncovered. "He didn't know it was Arlo," she said. "No, he didn't know which direction the danger was coming from. That was the problem. The network was too embedded. He couldn't identify the center of it. But he identified enough that someone felt they needed to kill him." "Yes." She finished the boot. She stood up. What happens at the council meeting if Moreno's people accept Arlo's story about me being a plant? They vote to nullify the claim, then they expect me to handle the problem. Handle meaning you don't leave the meeting. He said it flat, no performance, no softening, which is why we need Victor Marchetti's documentation authenticated before we walk into that room, and we need what's on that drive formatted in a way that can be presented to the council as evidence, not of the bloodline. They'll accept Marchetti's materials for that. Evidence of the network, of what Arlo did, of what some of the people in that meeting room may still be benefiting from. If we show them the network evidence, we're showing them their own exposure. Yes. That could go either way. Yes. He held her gaze, which is why we have 12 hours to build the case precisely enough that the only rational move for each of them is to accept it. The 12 hours that followed were the longest and most technically brutal of Serena's life, and she had once worked a 40-hour stretch in a commercial laundry facility when she was 19 and needed rent money by a specific date. The drive's contents were accessed on a clean laptop that one of Dante's men produced from a Faraday-lined case. No network connection, no vulnerability. A tech specialist named Rook, 20-something, perpetually chewing something that wasn't gum, worked through the drive's file structure with the focused silence of a man who loved problems more than he would ever love people. Serena sat beside him and navigated the folder hierarchy because she had seen the original and could direct him to what mattered. Dante stood behind them for the first 2 hours. Then he sat down, which told her how much the night was costing him physically. He had not eaten. She hadn't either. Neither of them mentioned it. This, Rook said at one point, flagging a financial file. This routing structure, you see how the intermediary accounts are all incorporated in the same 6-month window? That's not coincidence. Someone built a simultaneous architecture across 8 jurisdictions. That's sophisticated. He looked at Dante. Arlo? Arlo, Dante confirmed. He was good, Rook said, with the particular admiration of a craftsman evaluating craftsmanship in the absence of any moral framework whatsoever. He was the best I've ever worked with, Dante said, which means we need to be better than his best to untangle it. Give me 4 hours. You have 3. Rook chewed harder and went back to the screen. At 2 a.m., the first external pressure arrived. One of Dante's perimeter men reported a vehicle parked on the service road 300 meters from the estate's east wall. Not moving. Not law enforcement. No plates. No visible markings. Just sitting there in the dark, engine running, then a second vehicle. Quarter-mile to the north, then a third. Dante took the report and set his phone on the table with controlled deliberateness. They're not waiting for the meeting, he said. Serena looked up from the folder she'd been cross-referencing. They're going to take me before it. If there's no heir to present, there's no claim to vote on. He was already on a second phone, issuing instructions in the rapid shorthand of a man who has rehearsed for this scenario without knowing exactly when it would arrive. The estate's security hardened in the next 20 minutes. Men she hadn't seen in 4 years of living here appeared from positions within the property. The boathouse, the old groundskeeper's building, the garage upper level. The architecture of the compound's defense became visible in a way it never was in peacetime, and it was impressive and frightening in equal measure. Rook didn't look up from the laptop. At 3 a.m., the vehicles moved. The first one came through the east wall at speed, not through the gate but through the wall itself. A pickup truck with a reinforced front end that hit the stone barrier and came through in a cloud of dust and broken aggregate that the security cameras captured in perfect high-definition uselessness. Men came out of it fast and low, tactical, trained. The second came over the north fence. 4 men climbing equipment, silent until they weren't. Dante was already out of his chair. He looked at Serena. Stay with Rook, he said. Don't leave this room until I come back for you personally. And if someone else comes? He opened the desk drawer and placed a Glock on the table beside the laptop without ceremony. Then use your judgment. He left. The door closed. Rook glanced at the gun, glanced at Serena, went back to the screen. 3 more minutes on this routing chain, he said. The sounds of the compound in crisis were muffled by the study's reinforced walls. Shouting, the distant percussive thud of something exploding small and bright in the garden. More shouting, the specific crack of gunfire that no amount of architectural insulation fully absorbs. Serena sat in the chair beside Rook, with her hand 3 inches from the Glock, and her breathing measured through deliberate effort, and watched the routing chain on the screen resolve itself into a diagram that was, even to her non-specialist eye, devastatingly clear. "Done," Rook said. He hit a key sequence. Formatted for presentation, every transaction, every shell, every beneficiary name the algorithm could extract. He pulled a USB drive from the laptop and held it out to her. 47 individuals, 12 of them active in the Syndicate Council structure. She took it. The door to the study opened, not Dante. 2 men she didn't know, moving fast, with the specific purposeful economy of people who have been given a single task and are executing it without complication or hesitation. Behind them, walking with the careful, unhurried pace of a man who had decided that the time for subtlety was over, was a face she recognized from the gala, one of Moreno's lieutenants, a man named Cassian Cross, who had been pointed out to her the previous night by the woman in red as someone to watch. Rook was already standing, moving back, his hands up in the universal language of a man whose skill set is technical and who would like to keep using it. Cross looked at Serena. He looked at the USB drive in her hand. "I'll take that," he said. He had a voice like gravel in a jar, low and constant and without particular emotion. "It's evidence," Serena said, "for the council." "The council meeting has been canceled." He took 2 steps into the room. "Moreno doesn't need a meeting. He's calling the claim void. The consigliere's testimony has been accepted." He held out his hand. Same gesture as Arlo, hours ago on the pier, same extended palm, same patience, same absolute certainty that she would comply because the alternative was visible in the posture of the 2 men behind him. "The drive. And you're coming with us." Serena looked at the drive. She looked at the Glock, which was on the far side of the table and therefore on the far side of Cross, which meant it was not an option. She looked at Rook, who gave her a very small shake of his head that meant don't, and she agreed with his assessment. She looked at Cross. "Moreno doesn't have the authority to cancel a bloodline verification vote," she said. "That requires a full council majority. Victor Marchetti's family has a vote. So does the Keene operation out of Portland. So does the Tanaka group in Vancouver. Moreno is 1 vote. Cross tilted his head. Something shifted in his expression. Not uncertainty, not even surprise, but the specific micro-adjustment of a man who has encountered a variable he didn't include in his preparation. "You've been doing homework," he said. "I've been doing homework for 26 years, Serena said. "I just didn't know what it was for until 2 days ago." From outside the study, in the corridor, came the sound of running, multiple sets of feet. Then Dante's voice, closer than she'd expected, saying something curt and absolute to someone who did not respond. Cross heard it. He looked at the door. The calculation in his face completed itself in real time. Asset extraction in a contested structure, with the structure's owner returning to it, was a different operation than asset extraction in a clean environment, and the window for the former was closing. He looked back at Serena. "This doesn't end here," he said. "No," she agreed. "It ends at the council, with the evidence." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked at his 2 men and made a motion she didn't have a word for. A precise, practiced gesture that moved them both backward toward the window they had entered through with the smooth, coordinated reverse of men who had been trained to exit under pressure without making it look like retreat. Cross followed them. He stopped with one hand on the window frame and looked back at her once more. "Moreno will accept the evidence or he won't," Cross said. "But the people on that drive, the 47 names, they have more resources than one old man's bloodline documents and a dead consigliere's files. Think about that." He went out the window, 3 floors up, which told her they had rigging outside, which told her this had been planned long before tonight. The door opened. Dante came through it with blood on his left sleeve, not a wound, his posture and movement indicated, and stopped when he saw the room intact and Serena standing with the USB drive in her hand, and Rook already sitting back down and opening a new window on the laptop, with the focused resilience of someone who genuinely prefers to work through chaos rather than stop. Dante looked at the open window, looked at Serena. "Cross," she said. "He got out?" I let him. A pause. Why? Because shooting him wouldn't have solved the problem. The problem is the 47 names on this drive and what each of them will do when they realize what we have. She held up the USB. We need the council meeting. We need it tonight, not in 12 hours, before Moreno can organize a second approach. Dante looked at her. The blood on his sleeve, the controlled devastation still present behind his eyes from what he had learned about Arlo, now layered under the immediate operational pressure of a compound breach and an extraction attempt, and the knowledge that the man he had trusted for 30 years had spent 30 years building a structure inside his structure. Victor Marchetti, Dante said. If I get him on the phone in the next hour... He'll call the emergency session himself, Serena said. Moreno can't block a session called by a founding family representative. It's in the charter. Dante looked at her for a moment that was slightly too long for pure operational assessment. You read the charter, he said. I read everything in that room. Something moved in his expression that she didn't have a name for yet. There's a car outside, the secure vehicle, not the convoy. If I get Victor on the phone and he calls the session, we need to be at the Meridian in under an hour. He looked at the window Cross had gone through, the cold night air moving the curtain. They'll try again between here and there. I know. And you're still... I'm still, she said. Call Marchetti. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed. She could see in the set of his shoulders, the slight forward angle, the breath held to just below conscious threshold, the particular posture of a man who is, for the first time in a very long time, operating without the counsel of the person he had always called first. Operating instead beside someone new. Serena gripped the USB drive and felt the hard plastic edges bite into her palm and thought about her father. Not the photograph this time, not the smile, but the memo. The 4 pages of careful documentation. The sentence that ended mid-stroke, the pen dragged sideways across the page at the moment everything changed. She was not going to let her sentence end the same way. Victor Marchetti answered on the second ring, and Dante started talking. And outside the estate's damaged east wall, the 3 vehicles that had come for her were gone, but the road they had used was still there, still dark, still running directly toward the Meridian, and everything waiting. The road to the Meridian took 11 minutes at speed. Serena counted them by the streetlights, each one a brief orange flare against the wet windshield, each one behind them before it finished registering. Dante drove. Not a driver, not a convoy, just the 2 of them in the secure vehicle, which was armored in ways she could feel in how the car moved. Heavy and deliberate, slower to respond, built for survival rather than speed. The USB drive was in her jacket pocket. Victor Marchetti's call had lasted 4 minutes, and by the end of it, the old man's voice had carried something she recognized from the ballroom. That same quality of a long-carried weight, finding the possibility of being set down. He's calling it for midnight, Dante said. Emergency session under founding family authority. Moreno can't block it without violating the charter, and violating the charter gives every other vote on the council grounds to move against him. Will he respect it? Moreno respects power, and he respects architecture. The charter is architecture he helped build. Dante's hands were steady on the wheel. The blood on his sleeve had dried to a dark brown. He'll come to the table. With Cross. With Cross and whoever else he brought tonight. Dante glanced at her. The 47 names on that drive. How many of them are council members? 12 active. Some of the others are political. Judges, a federal prosecutor named Harlan Webb. The name registered in his face, a small tightening around the eyes. Webb has been investigating Voss operations for 10 years. Webb has been on Arlo's payroll for longer than that, Serena said. He's been shaping the investigations, closing lines of inquiry, making sure the network stayed buried. She paused. He's also the reason my father's disappearance was never formally investigated. The missing persons report my mother filed. It was buried in Webb's district. 3 weeks after it was filed, it was reclassified and sealed. Dante said nothing for a moment. The Meridian appeared ahead, its arched windows dark now, the gala's transformation stripped back to the building's industrial bones. Victor Marchetti had apparently moved fast. There were already vehicles in the lot, and the lights inside were coming on. The chandeliers from 2 nights ago replaced by the building's work lighting, fluorescent and unforgiving. Everything I've built, Dante said, not quite to her, has Webb's fingerprints on it. Every investigation that turned away, every federal case that collapsed. He pulled into the lot and stopped the car but didn't move to get out. I told myself it was competent lawyering, good operational security. He exhaled through his nose. I told myself a lot of things. Serena looked at his profile. The jaw that had been set wrong after a break, the exhaustion that had moved beyond the eyes and into the whole structure of his face. You believed what Arlo told you, she said. He was good at being believed. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed. It's not, but it's different from knowing. He turned to look at her. The car's interior was dim, the only light coming from the building ahead and the amber of a parking lot lamp 30 feet away, and in that light, his face was stripped of everything performative. Just a man in his 40s who had spent 30 years building an empire on a foundation that had been rotten at the center without his knowledge, sitting with the specific weight of what it meant to have been both powerful and deceived. I kept you here for 4 years, he said, under my roof, working my floors, because I thought I was protecting you. You were also controlling the variable, Serena said. Let's be honest about both things. A pause. Yes. It kept me alive, she said, whatever the reason. It kept me alive long enough to find that room. She pulled the USB from her pocket and looked at it. So we're going to go in there and we're going to finish this. And after that, she stopped. After that, Dante said. Neither of them completed the sentence. She got out of the car. The Meridian at midnight was a different place than the Meridian at 9 in the evening. The chandeliers were off, the candles long cold, the black marble floor reflecting the harsh work lights with none of the warmth that had made it beautiful 48 hours ago. The tables had been pushed to the walls. Chairs had been arranged in a rough circle in the center of the space, the kind of arrangement that made clear this was a working meeting rather than a social one. 11 people were already seated when Serena and Dante walked in. Victor Marchetti at the head, his black walnut cane propped against his chair, his face carrying the settled clarity of a man who has decided that tonight is the night certain things will be concluded. Katerina Novak from Vancouver, still in street clothes, her silver hair loose in a way that made her look both less formal and more dangerous. 4 other council members Serena recognized from the gala. 3 she didn't know. Moreno's seat was empty. Cassian Cross stood at the room's eastern edge, not seated, arms crossed, watching the entrance. He watched Serena walk in and his expression did not change. Beside him, 2 men she'd last seen exiting a third-floor window. Moreno arrived 7 minutes later. He was a compact man, 60s, with the particular authority of someone who has never needed height or volume to occupy space. He looked at Serena once, directly, the way a chess player looks at a piece that has just been moved to an unexpected square. Then he sat down. Victor Marchetti did not preamble. "We are here under Founding Family Emergency Authority," the old man said, his gravel voice filling the industrial space without effort. The agenda is 1 item. The bloodline claim of Serena Vale, heir to Lucian Vale, founding member of the council structure. This session is binding. What is decided here tonight cannot be revisited by any single family without full charter violation. Moreno's voice came from his seat, level and unimpressed. The claim is manufactured. We've established that. You've asserted it, Victor said. There's a difference. And the evidence you cited, a consigliere's testimony, is no longer available to you. He looked at Dante. Is it? Arlo Vance is in custody, Dante said, and I am formally withdrawing any reliance on his testimony regarding any matter before this council. The room absorbed that. Several people shifted in their chairs. The weight of what it meant, the head of the Voss Syndicate publicly distancing himself from his own consigliere in front of the entire council, was not lost on anyone in the room. These were people who understood structural earthquakes. Moreno looked at Dante for a long moment. You're exposing your own flank. I'm cleaning my own house, Dante said. There's a difference. Victor Marchetti's trembling hand produced a manila envelope from the document bag beside his chair. He placed it on the empty table in front of him. Lucien Vale left these materials with me in the 6 months before he disappeared. Bloodline documentation. Authenticated by 3 independent genealogical sources in the years since. Birth records. Maternal chain. Genetic markers cross-referenced against the Vale family records held in the original charter archive. He looked around the circle. I have been waiting 25 years for the person these documents describe to walk into a room I was standing in. His wet, bright eyes moved to Serena. She was wearing his pendant. She said his name without coaching, and she has his eyes. Serena stood at the edge of the circle and did not move and did not speak. She felt the room's attention like pressure, not hostile, not welcoming, but the specific weight of powerful people recalibrating. Moreno turned to her. The pendant can be stolen. The name can be researched. The documentation can be forged. He said it without hostility, the way a lawyer presents an argument. What we need is something that can't be manufactured. What does she know that only Lucien's blood would know? It was a fair challenge. She'd been thinking about it since the car. Room 4 of the original charter archive, Serena said, the founding clause that created the bloodline protocol. Lucien Vale added a subclause that was never made part of the public charter record. A fail-safe. She reached into her jacket and produced the folded phone photograph she'd taken of the memo's final page. Not the page that ended mid-sentence, but the page before it, which she had read in the 30 seconds before Arlo appeared, and which had burned itself into her memory with the precision that only information received in the presence of danger achieves. The subclause states that any founding bloodline heir, in order to invoke counsel rights, must be able to identify the location of a specific document held outside the archive, a document that describes the original 3 families' agreement in Lucien's own handwriting, not a copy, the original. She looked at Victor. He told you where it was. The room was completely still. Victor's trembling intensified. His eyes had gone full and bright. He told one person, the old man said. Not me. He told his daughter. She was 3 years old. He read it to her like a story. His voice broke at the last word and reconstructed itself. He said a 3-year-old wouldn't remember the information, but she would remember the feeling of it. And when the time came, the feeling would lead her back. Serena reached into the other pocket of her jacket. She produced a folded sheet of paper. Not from the locked room, not from the drive. From her own wooden box, the scratched and tape-hinged box that had sat in her locker for 4 years. A page she had found inside the box's false bottom 2 years ago and had not known what to do with. Handwritten. The paper aged, the ink faded at the edges. She unfolded it and set it on the table in the center of the circle. She didn't look at it. She had read it 100 times. My father put it in the box with the pendant, she said. The box my mother gave me when I was 8. She said he had left it for me. She didn't know what was in the false bottom. She paused. Neither did I, until I'd been carrying it for 18 years. The silence held for 3 seconds. Then Victor Marchetti made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything else and pressed his fist against his mouth. Moreno leaned forward and looked at the document on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Serena. Then he sat back in his chair with the controlled exhale of a man completing a calculation that has arrived at a result he did not prefer. Call for verification, he said, by the charter. Victor called it. The vote was 8-2 with 1 abstention. The 2 were Moreno's proxies. The abstention was a council member Serena didn't know who appeared to be hedging against whichever direction the room fell. The claim was verified. What happened next took 40 minutes and felt like 40 years. The USB drive was connected to a laptop one of Dante's men had brought. Rook's formatted evidence played across a screen that someone had set up against the east wall. Routing structures, shell companies, transaction chains, and the 47 names, each one appearing with its documentation, each one sitting in the room like a stone dropped into standing water. 12 council members, 7 politicians. Harlan Webb's name, with 23 years of documented transactions beneath it, landed in the room with the specific impact of an object dropped from a height. 3 of the 12 council members on the list were in the room. Serena watched them in her peripheral vision as their names appeared, watched the decision-making process run across their faces in real time. The calculation of exposure versus cooperation, of how much the documentation could be challenged versus how much it had already been seen. Watch them arrive one by one at the same conclusion. The network was finished. The only question was how they positioned themselves relative to its ending. By 2 a.m., Moreno had made a proposal that surprised her with its pragmatism, a structured dissolution of the network's remaining assets, a collective agreement to provide federal documentation on web in exchange for investigative immunity on the council's internal operations, and a formal recognition of the Vale bloodline claim with the associated council seat. Webb goes, Moreno said. He's been managing the federal exposure for 30 years. Without him, we're vulnerable. But with him in the network, we're finished the moment this documentation reaches anyone outside this room. He looked at Serena. The Vale seat comes with specific authority over the maritime operations, Lucien's original domain. A pause. It's what he built. It should go back to his blood. Serena looked at Dante. Dante said nothing. His face said everything she needed. She looked at Moreno. The dissolution of the network is complete, not partial. Every asset, every shell, every political relationship built on the network's money. She held his gaze. And the maritime operations under the Vale seat function independently, not under Voss authority, not under Moreno oversight. Independent. Moreno considered her for a moment with the specific attention of a man repricing something he thought he understood. You've been a maid for 4 years, he said. It wasn't contempt, it was closer to confusion. I've been paying attention for 26, she said. He accepted the terms. The meeting ended at 2:47 a.m. People left in ones and twos, the room emptying with the quiet efficiency of people who have concluded dangerous business and wish to return to their ordinary lives with minimum exposure. Katerina Novak stopped beside Serena on her way out and looked at her with the same diamond-sharp attention she'd deployed 2 nights ago in the ballroom. Your father would have made a terrible criminal, Katerina said. He had too much conscience for it. I know. You might have the same problem. Probably, Serena said. Katerina almost smiled. Good, she said, and walked out. Victor Marchetti was last. He moved slowly, the cane working the floor with careful placement, and stopped in front of Serena with an effort that was visible in every joint. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the ballroom, with that raw, calcified reverence. But it was different now, quieter. The shock had passed, and what remained was something more sustainable. He asked me to tell you something, the old man said. If I ever found you, if you ever came into a room I was standing in. He paused, gathering it. He said, the pendant isn't the inheritance, you are. Everything else is just metal. Serena's throat closed. She kept her face level through an effort she was not sure she could have described or replicated. She nodded once. Victor patted her hand with his trembling one. Then he moved toward the exit, and his driver appeared from somewhere to take his arm, and he went out into the Seattle night without looking back. Serena stood alone in the center of the empty meridian, the work lights humming overhead, the black marble floor reflecting nothing now that the chandeliers were cold and the candles were dead. The folded document was back in her pocket. The USB drive was with Dante's people. The pendant rested against her sternum, warm from her skin. She heard his footsteps behind her, recognized them. 4 years of listening to this house move had calibrated her ear to his specific rhythm, slightly uneven, the left foot landing with a fraction more weight, an old injury she'd never heard the story of. Dante stopped a few feet back. He didn't speak immediately. The silence between them was different from every silence they had shared before. Not the silence of hierarchy, not the silence of concealment, but the silence of 2 people standing on ground that has just been remade and learning the feel of it. The maritime seat, he said finally. It means offices, staff, capital to establish operations. He paused. The Voss organization can provide transition support if that's wanted. Is that what you're calling it? Serena said. I don't know what to call it. His voice was rougher than usual. The control fraying slightly at its edges in the way that control does when the emergency that was holding it together has passed. I've been running this organization for 15 years with a man I trusted completely, standing behind my left shoulder. I'm 41 years old, and I've just spent the last 6 hours learning that the architecture of my professional life was built on a foundation that included the murder of the man who taught me this business. A pause. I don't know what I'm calling most things right now. She turned to face him. He looked like what he was, a man who had been awake for 40 hours carrying impossible weight, whose left sleeve was dark with dried blood that wasn't his, who was standing in the empty room where 2 nights ago he had brought a servant to be diminished, and watching that plan's wreckage arranged around him in every direction. You said you kept me alive, she said. Yes. You also kept me invisible, kept me small, used me as an instrument when it suited you. She said it without heat, the way you state the load-bearing facts of a structure you're examining. All of that is also true. All of that is also true, he agreed. So what happens now is not... She stopped, choosing the words with care. It's not gratitude, and it's not forgiveness. Those aren't the right words for what this is. What are the right words? She thought about it. About the locked room and Arlo's face and the memo that ended mid-stroke. About 4 years of cold tile and bleach and careful invisibility. About a father who had built a failsafe into a child too young to know what she was carrying, who had trusted the future with the most important thing he had. I don't have them yet, she said, but I'll know them when they arrive. Dante looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled. Not resolved, not healed, but settled. The way sediment settles after water has been violently disturbed. It would take time to become clear again. That was the honest version. Arlo, she said, what happens to him? He answers for what he did. Internally first. Then, he paused. There are people on that drive who will want to manage him before he can manage them. The council agreed to a process. His voice dropped. I'll make sure it's thorough. And Webb. The documentation goes to a federal contact I trust, one who isn't on the drive. A pause. It'll take time. These things take time, but Webb's career is finished as of tonight, and the investigation he's been shaping for a decade will be reopened under new supervision. Serena nodded. It wasn't justice in the clean, absolute sense that the word implied when people used it in comfortable contexts. It was the version of justice available inside the structure she was standing in. Partial, procedural, achieved through the same mechanisms that had buried the truth for 25 years, now turned in the opposite direction. It was not satisfying. It was real. She pulled the pendant from beneath her jacket and held it in her palm. The tarnished silver, the coiled serpent, the single star. The pendant isn't the inheritance. You are. She closed her fingers around it and put it back. 3 months passed. The Webb investigation was reopened in October under a special prosecutor with no historical connection to Pacific Northwest organized crime. The announcement was 4 paragraphs in the Seattle Times, buried below the fold on a Tuesday. Serena read it on her phone in the offices of Vail Maritime, a small firm occupying the 4th floor of a building 2 blocks from the waterfront, its name on the door in plain sans serif letters that she had chosen herself. No serif? No flourish. Something that looked like it intended to be there for a long time. The staff was small. An operations manager named Yusuf, who had 20 years in legitimate shipping and had asked no questions about the funding source and had so far proved worth every dollar. 2 analysts. A legal consultant who worked 3 days a week and spent the other 4 apparently mountain climbing, which Serena had decided was his business. And Rook, who had appeared one morning with a laptop bag and a thermos and an expression that suggested he considered the transition from criminal tech specialist to maritime operations analyst to be a lateral move at best, and who was already more valuable than anyone else on the payroll. She worked long hours. She had always worked long hours. The nature of the labor had changed, not the hours. She arrived early and left late and ate meals at her desk that she forgot to taste and rebuilt from nothing. The working knowledge of an industry she had inherited by blood without instruction. She learned. She was good at learning. She had been paying attention for 26 years to things that other people filed under irrelevant, and it turned out that almost nothing was irrelevant. Arlo Vance was tried internally before a council tribunal in November. She was not present. She received a one-line message from Dante afterward, concluded. She sat with that word for a long time and felt less than she had expected to feel and more than she could account for. She was not sure if that was grief or relief or the specific emotional flatness that arrives when something you have been carrying for your entire conscious life is finally set down and you discover that your arms don't know what to do with the absence of the weight. She visited her mother in Portland in November. Her mother was 61 and lived in a small house near the river and grew tomatoes in the backyard with the specific devotion of someone who had decided that edible things were more trustworthy than people. They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee, and Serena told her as much of the truth as was safe to tell, which was most of it. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When Serena finished, her mother looked at her hands wrapped around the coffee mug and said, "I knew he hadn't run. I always knew." And then she refilled both their cups and went back to the tomatoes, and that was all, which was enough. The Voss Syndicate reorganized through the winter. Dante dismantled the network's remaining infrastructure, piece by piece, with the specific methodical attention of a man settling a debt he had not known he owed. Some of it was public: shell company dissolutions, asset transfers that appeared in business filings without context. Most of it was not. Serena heard about it in pieces, through Rook's peripheral knowledge and Yusuf's shipping industry contacts, and occasionally through a brief message from Elena Marchetti, who had positioned herself in the reorganized structure with the unsentimental competence of a woman who had always known more than her job title suggested. She and Dante did not speak directly for 6 weeks after the Meridian. Then he called one evening when she was working late in the Empty Vale Maritime offices, the waterfront visible through the window, the bay dark and still. "The web prosecution is moving faster than expected," he said. "I saw. Victor Marchetti had a second stroke last week. He's stable. He wanted me to tell you." "Tell him thank you." A pause. "I'd like to come by the office if that's—" He stopped. "If that's appropriate." She looked at the window, at the water, at the building's reflection broken on the surface of the bay. "Thursday," she said. "Morning. Bring coffee. Rook drinks his black and judges people who don't." A pause that had something different in it. "Thursday," he said. She hung up and went back to the shipping manifest she'd been annotating and worked for another 2 hours before she stopped and put on her coat and took the elevator down to the street. The waterfront at night was cold and salt-smelled and enormous in the way that bodies of water are enormous when you're standing at their edge. The city compressed behind you and everything ahead dark and open and without limit. She walked to the end of the nearest pier and stood with her hands in her pockets and looked out at the sound. She thought about her father. Not the photograph, not the smile, not the memo. Just the man himself, constructed from absence and inference and the feel of a story read to a 3-year-old in a voice she couldn't remember, but that had left a shape in her memory like a hand pressed into wet clay before it hardened. He had built a system. He had found the rot inside it. He had paid for the finding with everything. And then he had put the inheritance in a box with a pendant and a false bottom and trusted his daughter to carry it without knowing what she carried. And she had carried it for 23 years through poverty and labor, and the specific grinding invisibility of a life that had never quite fit. And here she was, standing at the end of a pier, her name on a door 2 blocks away, the pendant warm against her sternum. She pulled it out and held it over the water and looked at it for a long time. Not to drop it, just to see it against the darkness of the bay. The silver and the serpent and the single embedded star reflecting the city's light back at itself in the way that all surfaces do when they are finally held up to the right illumination. Then she put it back inside her jacket and pressed her hand flat against her chest and felt it there, its edges and its weight, the specific gravity of something that had been waiting a long time to arrive where it belonged. The water moved below the pier. The city made its constant noise behind her. Somewhere across the sound, a shipping light moved slow and steady through the dark, heading north, carrying whatever it carried toward wherever it was going. She watched it until it disappeared. Then she turned around and walked back toward the lights.